Oh, yes. Nice to see you. Doing good. I got to give Miss Rita a quick hug.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Nice to see you, man. Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
I'm so glad to see you. How's everything?
Everything's good.
Great.
I'm feeling good.
You're looking good too.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay, yes. Well, good morning. Good morning to all of you. I'm here in person today, and to the people who are joining via the live stream. So it is a great pleasure to reach the end of, not to reach the end, but it's a great pleasure that we managed to get to this point with our Bicentennial historical lectures, which have been, I have to say, quite popular. And the last one is one which we have been looking forward to very much. So the speaker is known to us, Father Brandt. He's been here already. He's lectured here already last year, I think.
It was in January.
In January. This year in January. He comes from Maryland, where he's the chaplain of St. James School in Hagerstown and Vicar of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Boonsboro. So the topic of the lecture today is Rector Frederick Myers Morris, St. Thomas Church's civil right rector. So it's really good to have the opportunity to reflect on the contribution of St. Thomas to this very important page of the history of our country. So without further ado, we welcome Father Brandt, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very kindly. Appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for your welcome of me again back home here to St. Thomas. I consider St. Thomas to be my second home parish because this was a place where the priest that I aspire to be still, I got my grounding here at St. Thomas Church and with all of you. And there are several familiar faces here that I love very much who were very helpful to me during my time here as seminarian, starting back in 2011. And so thank you all so very much for being here. Thank you for all of you who are here in the building. And for those of you listening on the webcast, thank you for joining me for this important lecture, and I'm honored to give it. And so I would like to begin by reading from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. Jesus said, "Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." The word of the Lord. And so the overall point that Jesus is emphasizing here at this point of his Sermon on the Mount is not to purposely draw attention to oneself. So the charitable acts that we do, they should be done in such a way that maintains for us a low profile. and when we do them. So we're not supposed to draw attention to ourselves when we're doing acts of charity. Just let the right thing be the right thing and just let the action speak for itself. And so being modest, not doing things just for attention, but being modest, that is one of the true marks of a follower of Jesus Christ. And so I began with that illustration from Jesus' words on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew to illustrate some of the challenges, if you will, that I had in preparing this lecture on Dr. Frederick Myers Morris, who was the rector here at St. Thomas Church during the Civil Rights Movement. And the challenge that I ran into was the fact that there really isn't a lot of written things down from Dr. Morris in regards to his civil rights legacy. But there are some aspects from his background and his rectorship here that are known. So there are some actions that he has done that point to where his inclinations were regarding the civil rights movement. And his inclinations toward the civil rights movement were very positive, were very supportive. And so what he did not write down, he showed in actions. And so from this, I would like to put forward the view that though what is not written down, that his actions really showed where his heart was. And so this could actually be a good thing. And it showed Dr. Morris as a Christian of true action. He really believed in what he preached. And he did this because it was the right thing to do. And so we will go forward in our time together. We will be looking at those things that are known about Dr. Morris and seeing from them the lasting legacy that he left St. Thomas Church from his 18-year rectorship, and how his legacy as the civil rights rector here at St. Thomas helped lead the parish to being what it today is. And so, just a brief overview of Dr. Morris's rectorship. He was rector here at St. Thomas from October of 1954 until 1972. And he came from a deeply Episcopal Church family. Not only was he a priest, his father was a priest, his father-in-law was a priest, and two of his brothers-in-law were priests. And one of his brothers-in-law, Bradford Hastings, became the Bishop Suffragan of Connecticut. He was elected Bishop Suffragan of Connecticut in 1981 and stayed in that position until he retired in 1986. And just trying to dig deeper into more of Dr. Morris's family, there was an oral history that I got wind of about Bradford Hastings that was given by one of his former parishioners who himself became a priest. And this former parishioner of Bishop Hastings described him as being liberal and ecumenical in attitude. And so, with that being said, that signified to me that Dr. Morris just wasn't kind of an odd duck in his family, if you will, that this really was more so a family affair. He came from a family, and he came from a background that really valued doing the right thing and treating all people with respect and dignity. And so with that, with this emphasis of doing the right thing and helping other people and being an agent for positive change, that informed a lot of the things that Dr. Morris had done during his rectorship here, during his 18 years. Like, for instance, he was the rector who really emphasized having pensions, monetary pensions, for staff members here at the church, rewarding them for their long time service. He felt that that was the right thing to do. He was the parishioner who started what is now the Every Member Canvass here at St. Thomas Church. I believe y'all still have the Every Member Canvass every year, because believe it or not, back in the old days, well, back when Father Morris, or Dr. Morris rather, first came here, they still had pew rents here at St. Thomas. Renting of pews was still a thing here at St. Thomas when he came, and it was in the 60s, 1961, November 5th, 1961, that pew rents officially ended here at St. Thomas. He had worked to end that. Trinity Church Wall Street had already ended it. The chapel that St. Thomas had ended it. He said it was time to do it here. And November 5th, 1961, that was a very purposeful date. Can anybody guess why it was? All Saints Day. All Saints Sunday. The ending of pew rents. A very good day to end that. And of course, this informed what would be his support for the civil rights movement. And so Dr. Morris, he did all these things because he was a person, and Father Wright in his history of St. Thomas characterized Dr. Morris of doing this. He really emphasized practical Christianity. And this was because of the fact Dr. Morris was a low church evangelical. A little different from what St. Thomas Church is today. But that is what he was. He was a low church evangelical, very different from the leadership of his immediate predecessor at the time, Dr. Roloff Hasbrook Brooks, and from his predecessor 2 times back, Dr. Ernest Stiers, who ended up becoming Bishop of Long Island. And I believe Bishop Franklin gave a lecture on Dr. Stiers some time ago. And so, as I'm sure Bishop Franklin had emphasized, Dr. Stiers was a bit of a high churchman, and both Dr. Stiers and Dr. Brooks, they had emphasized the Eucharist being a principal service. And so there was more frequent celebration of the Holy Eucharist during their time here. But when Dr. Morris came here as rector, within a year, he scaled the celebrations of the Holy Eucharist back, and he went back to the old school classic Anglicana practice of morning prayer being the principal liturgy and having Eucharist 1 time a month. Wow. That was old school. And so as an evangelical, Dr. Morris emphasized practical Christianity, the doing of Christian service through all aspects of one's life. And because evangelicals are very much about spreading the word of God and being conduits of God's work in this world. And so he came to be this way because he was a 1930 graduate. Dr. Morris was a 1930 graduate of Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. And for those of you who may know your church history, back in this time, and even for several decades after that, Virginia Seminary was the Episcopal Church's historic low church evangelical seminary. And it was very different from the more high church and Anglo-Catholic General Theological Seminary located on 9th Avenue and 23rd Street in Chelsea. Today, Virginia Seminary was founded particularly to be a reaction to General Seminary. General was high, so Virginia was going to be low. And so Virginia Seminary, for a long time, and even still, had a legacy of many of its students taking action and taking part in some of the big issues of their time. So like, for instance, Phillips Brooks, who was basically the Charles Spurgeon of Anglican Christianity, one of the great preachers of the late 19th century in the Episcopal Church. When he was a student at Virginia Seminary in the mid-19th century, he made it abundantly clear that he was not in support of slavery. And Phillips Brooks basically forced the Virginia Seminary faculty and administration to have an on-campus conversation about the right versus wrong of slavery, and said that if Virginia Seminary did not allow for those who disagreed with slavery to voice their opinions and to take part in this issue, then they were going to up and leave. And so Virginia Seminary, instead of losing students, i.e. losing money, they allowed them to have that conversation. But that was something that Phillips Brooks had done and that he was on record for. Years later, John Thomas Walker, who would end up being the first African-American bishop of the Diocese of Washington in the 70s. He was the first African-American student at Virginia Seminary after it integrated in 1953, and he would be very involved in the civil rights movement. And you also had John Elbridge Himes, who was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church during the 60s, also a Virginia Theological Seminary alum. And as presiding bishop, he would have the Episcopal Church go full throttle into being involved in the civil rights movement. And Bishop Hines, he was the Bishop of Texas before he became presiding bishop. So he was very much kind of like in the Lyndon Baines Johnson vein of things. Lyndon Johnson, who was president of the United States, also from Texas, very much in support of civil rights. But I bring all this up to say that Virginia Seminary has had this tradition because of its evangelical fervor of sending students out who were involved in challenging the church to be more of what it could be, of what God was calling it to be. Now, all of its students were that way, but there were a good many students of that institution who were, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And Virginia Theological Seminary was also an institution from which many of the Episcopal Church's missionaries, both here in the United States and abroad, internationally, were trained, again, because of that evangelical tradition. And so there was a tradition where many of Virginia's Theological Seminary students, they would be trained for the ministry, and they would go off to China, they would go off to other Asian countries, they would go to all parts of the world and proclaim the gospel. And so the reason I bring this up is because Dr. Morris's time at Virginia Seminary more than likely influenced a lot of what he did, that evangelical fervor. And so most likely, especially when Dr. Morris was first ordained to the ordained ministry, he spent some years doing missionary work among the Arapaho Nation. And so being in contact with people who were different from him and doing ministry among those people likely reconfirmed to him the need that we need to be open to all people because God created all people. And that is the way that it is. And also, his evangelicalism informed his practical Christianity for how he brought morning prayer back as the principal service here at St. Thomas. And so morning prayer is a teaching office. So the Eucharist is more of a proclamatory office where you hear the word proclaimed and then you act it out through the Eucharist. And that's a very good thing. But morning prayer, it is meant to be a teaching office wherein you sit for the lessons and you are learning from the word. And so Dr. Morris, he felt that morning prayer, in addition to increasing one's appreciation for the Eucharist, that morning prayer was the most effective way of teaching the people the precepts of the faith, what God is calling us to do and how God is calling us to be the church in this day and age. And I want to just emphasize that, some of you kind of bristled at the fact that, morning prayer, principal service. That's where the majority of the Episcopal Church was when Dr. Morris first became rector in 1954. It was still the majority of Episcopal churches. Morning prayer was the principal service, Eucharist once a month. And so what he was doing wasn't that out of character from most of the Episcopal Church. And of course, the 1928 prayer book was still in effect then, and the 28 prayer book emphasized that morning and evening prayer in the Eucharist, those were the services of the church. So Dr. Morris was, he was basically, in vogue with where it was. But as time would go on, and as you would have the liturgical movement, which would bring back focus of the Eucharist being the principal service of the church, that would change. And so when Dr. Morris was the rector here from 1954 to 1972, the Episcopal Church itself was just beginning to change its ways and its attitudes toward race. The Episcopal Church's involvement with race, particularly with slavery in the years before, wasn't very good. In the South, the Episcopal Church was the slave-holding church. hence why a lot of African Americans in the South typically aren't Episcopalians. So in the South, I would be a rarity because of that history. But in the 50s, that began to change. And so here I have some very important dates just to symbolize how the Episcopal Church was beginning to shift on race. So like, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, in 1953, Virginia Seminary, Dr. Morris's seminary alma mater, had integrated. And John Thomas Walker became the first black student, and he would graduate from Virginia Seminary. And at this time, there was a call, and a lot of people find this very amazing. There was a call in the early 50s by the Province 4 Synod. Province 4 was the Synod of the old Confederacy. So it had states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, my home state of Alabama, Tennessee, everything like that. The Province 4 Synod basically said that they do not believe that it is feasible for the province to have its own separate seminary for black students, and instead called for theological seminaries of the Episcopal Church to integrate, all of them to integrate, and to welcome students of color, African Americans, to study there for the priesthood. And they specifically called out the School of Theology at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, which was their provincial seminary. It would lead to a little tossing and turning, but Sewanee would eventually integrate as a result of Province 4 calling for that. And so that was amazing that the province of the former Confederacy made that call, and that the Women's Auxiliary of the Diocese of North Carolina had supported it. So it just goes to show that even in the South, there were areas that were calling for racial change among the Episcopal Church. In 1954, 10 days before Dr. Morris was elected the rector by the vestry, you would have the Brown v. Board of Education decision decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, and this was a unanimous decision. And there would be many Episcopal bishops who would counsel the Episcopal Church that they needed to support the Brown decision as the law of the land, and that it is our duty as Episcopalians to do so. You would have Randolph Royal Claiborne, Bishop of Atlanta, call for that. William Henry Marmion, Bishop of Southwestern Virginia, who became bishop of that diocese soon after the Brown decision was decided, called for that. So there was support for it among Episcopalians. Then in 1959, you had the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity, organized at St. Augustine's College, which is a historically black college affiliated with the Episcopal Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. Started off with just, I think, a little over 100 clergy and laity who were supportive of civil rights. But then by the 1960s, it would grow to well over 1,000. And then in 1963, you had Arthur Lichtenberger, who was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church at the time. He issued his Whit Sunday statement, which stated that the Episcopal Church needed to be involved with the civil rights movement. And that was a progression of presiding bishops of the Episcopal Church who encouraged involvement in the civil rights. And because of the fact that you had leadership on the top who was supportive of this, it helped a lot of Episcopalians see the need for it. Before presiding Bishop Lichtenberger, you had Henry Knox Sherrill, who was presiding bishop immediately before him. He was on President Truman's committee on civil rights in the 40s and 50s, and that committee on civil rights that President Truman had called for would be the body that would help lead to the integration of the armed forces, leading President Truman to lead that. And presiding Bishop Sherrill was part of that. Then you had presiding Bishop Lichtenberger, who called for involvement in the civil rights, and then after presiding Bishop Lichtenberger, you would have presiding Bishop Hines take office, and he would be very much full on. He was on the front lines with Dr. Martin Luther King in marching for civil rights. That's how committed presiding Bishop Hines was. And so I bring all that up just to say that Dr. Morris, in his own support of the civil rights movement, he was in good company. He was in very good company of people who supported it and who frankly had his back on it. And he was very clearly concerned about the social issues of the day, and he made that very well known. And so the next point here, Dr. Morris's support for the civil rights movement, and I have here a public disagreement with a Southern bishop. And so this is one of the few things that is written down about Dr. Morris's support for the civil rights movement, and it is very clear that you could feel the passion for it. And so the Southern bishop with whom Dr. Morris had a public disagreement with about this was Charles C.J. Carpenter. You all have heard me mention about Bishop Carpenter before. He was the Bishop of Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement, bishop for 30 years in Alabama from 1938 to 1968, and I wrote my master's thesis at General on him. And Bishop Carpenter was one of the 8 white religious leaders that Dr. King responded to in his famous letter from Birmingham jail. And so the reason why I bring up Bishop Carpenter and this public disagreement is that Bishop Carpenter, for a good many years during Dr. Morris's rectorship, he was a Lenten preacher here at St. Thomas, Fifth Avenue. He was one of the favorite Lenten preachers that St. Thomas had. People always looked forward to him coming. Bishop Carpenter was a larger than life figure. He was tall and he was tall. and he had these big hands and he had this booming voice. And there are people in the Diocese of Alabama who still recall him. They were just little kids when he was bishop. And whenever he would do confirmations, he would put his big hands on their head and he would say in that booming voice, "We pray for you, O Lord, to strengthen this your servant and strengthen them more and more." I mean, he had this booming voice and everything like that. So he was a very, very popular Lenten preacher here at St. Thomas. And Dr. Morris always invited him. In 1963, though, if you know, well, I'm sure you all know your United States history, 1963 was a very violent year when it came to the civil rights movement, particularly in Birmingham, Alabama. You had the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, in which 4 little girls were killed. In addition to that, you had, and I'm trying to be Christian here, you had Bull Connor, who was the commissioner of police in Birmingham, who did everything that he could to squash the civil rights movement, and who was very clear, even until the day he died in the 70s, who believed that, that African Americans and whites should not be integrated. He held that view to the day he died. He was out there doing all sorts of things to squash the civil rights demonstrations, including having hoses turned on protesters. And there were many civil rights protests going on in the streets. Well, in 1963, George Moseley Murray, who was Bishop Carpenter's coadjutor in Alabama and who would eventually succeed him, he had written something in which he had defended the Birmingham Police Department's handling of the protest going on in Birmingham. Saying that, the Birmingham Police Department, all they're trying to do is just to keep the peace and everything like that. And Bishop Murray, in addition to Bishop Carpenter, felt that the civil rights fight needed to be fought in the courtroom, not on the streets. And so he wrote a piece in which he defended the Birmingham Police Department in what they were doing to try to tamper down the violence in the demonstrations. Well, as far as Dr. Morris is concerned, that was not right. That statement infuriated Dr. Morris, infuriated him. So much so that Dr. Morris had written in the June 1963 St. Thomas Church Bulletin that Bishop Murray's defenses of the Birmingham Police Department showed a lack of courageous leadership in advancing the cause of justice and upholding the laws of the land, which Dr. Morris felt gave rights to every single American. And I remember seeing this. I first saw this in the Diocese of Alabama archives in Bishop Carpenter's papers, this copy of the June 1963 bulletin, and you could just really sense just really the passion coming from Dr. Morris's words from that newsletter. I mean, it was clear where he stood. And so Bishop Carpenter got wind of Dr. Morris's statements, criticizing Bishop Murray's words about the Birmingham Police Department. And Bishop Carpenter, likewise, was so enraged by Dr. Morris's criticism, so much so that Bishop Carpenter wrote a note to him in response and said that in light of the current strained relationship that we have and all that, Bishop Carpenter retracted his acceptance of Dr. Morris's invitation to preach Lent 1964 here at St. Thomas. That is how strained the relationship got between the two. Now, I do know that when Bishop Carpenter died in June of 1969, Dr. Morris did write a little short statement, praising Bishop Carpenter as one of the great bishops of the church and everything like that. But we don't know for certain if they were able to fully repair the friendship that they had. But we do know for certain that in 1963 and 1964, the relationship was strained because of Dr. Morris's belief that the civil rights movement was a worthy cause and that Episcopalians needed to take an active part in it, and basically criticizing Bishop Carpenter's lack of involvement in the movement and everything like that. And here is where background, again, is very important. Because just like Dr. Morris was, Bishop Carpenter was himself a graduate of Virginia Theological Seminary. But unlike Dr. Morris, Bishop Carpenter was a little bit more of an old school high church Episcopalian. And the old school high church Episcopalians, they were more reserved. They were more gradual. They did not want to rock the boat because they did not want to do anything that caused disunity within the church. And that's what Bishop Carpenter thought that Episcopalians being actively involved in the civil rights movement was doing. It was causing disunity within the church. It was causing attitudes to be ratcheted up, and he could not stand the violence. So that's why he said, let us just be more gradual. Let us just go about this slowly and more calmly, and let us work with the civil authorities in order to get a better outcome out of this. But Dr. Morris, he grew up in the North. He had always had relationships with people who were different from he was. Bishop Carpenter grew up in the Old South. And so you had differing of opinions there, but background is very important. But I think it would be clear to say that the majority of the Episcopal Church, or a good many of the Episcopal Church at that time, was on Dr. Morris's side. Because I remember when I was researching Bishop Carpenter, there would be people, letters just coming in, just saying to Bishop Carpenter from bishops around the Episcopal Church saying, Chuck, what are you doing? And so Dr. Morris was one of those people who was basically saying, Chuck, what are you doing? Get with the program here. And that's something that St. Thomas Church can be very proud of regarding Dr. Morris, that he took a strong stand in support of the civil rights movement and encouraged active participation in it. And so as his rectorship was coming to an end in 1971 and 1972, Dr. Morris felt that he was getting a little bit out of touch with where the church was going, particularly when it came to the liturgy, because in the early 70s you would have beginning the turn toward what would become the 1979 prayer book. And so the Eucharist was becoming the principal service of the church in a lot of places. So again, you would have this shift due to the liturgical movement going on at the time of the Eucharist becoming the principal service of the church and morning prayer not having that principal aspect. And so Dr. Morris, he really did believe in the efficacy of morning prayer and the importance of morning prayer as the principal service. And that was likely one of the things that encouraged him to say, maybe it's time for me to go, and everything like that. And of course, now the 1979 prayer book that we have has the Eucharist as the principal service. But before he left, he wanted to be sure that the liberation statues that I believe are on the tower here at the church, just outside, that the 3 liberation statues were up in place. This would be his last thing before he would go. And these liberation statues are of William Wilberforce, who was the great person in Great Britain who worked for the abolition of the slave trade in England and in the British Empire. Martin Luther King Jr., who was the great moral leader of the civil rights movement and advocated for civil disobedience and non-violence, peaceful protest in that fight. And Mary McLeod Bethune, who represented the female leadership of the civil rights movement and was a very great, famed educator. He wanted to be sure that that was done before he left. It just really cemented what he felt was the important thing. And so I would like to just close by saying that, of course, St. Thomas Church today is known throughout the world as being a great parish church of the Anglo-Catholic tradition. But I think that this rectorship of Dr. Morris during such a pivotal time in our country's history was a very worthy thing. And that having that evangelical focus for the parish and Dr. Morris advocating for the civil rights movement and for social justice as he did was very crucial for St. Thomas, because he showed the truth of the old adage in the church that to be Catholic is to be evangelical, and that to be evangelical is to be Catholic. In other words, you are concerned with the whole. The church is concerned with the whole because God is concerned with the whole. And so I think Dr. Morris did a lot to pave the way for his successors that came. Canon Andrew, Father Meade, Canon Turner, here now. A lot of what St. Thomas Church is today, I think that Dr. Morris was the John the Baptist for them. To which, so if you look out into the church today and see just the diversity of the races and the peoples and the classes that are here, I think we have Dr. Morris to thank for that. And so may God bless him. May he rest from their labors, and may he intercede for us to the Lord our God. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did your research show any indication about the health of the parish? And did they support, did the parishioners support what Dr. Morris was doing?
The research that I saw stated that largely they did. Largely they did. Because of the fact I couldn't find any evidence of any mass exoduses from the parish at that time. And one of the things that Dr. Morris did, and I think that Canon Andrew helped do this, is that Dr. Morris, he really, and this is what he did through morning prayer and everything like that, he really tried to emphasize to the parish, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it. So he didn't just, blurt it out and just do it just to do it. He took time to explain to the parish, this is why this is important.
In his preaching.
Yes, exactly. And that is another reason why morning prayer he felt was important, because it was a teaching office to which he could tell the parish, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And so, I think he was effective. And largely, his 18-year rectorship was very effective as a result of that. He helped get the chapel that St. Thomas had to parochial status, and before that, getting them to be a pew rent-free parish, so a free parish. He believed that was important.
That's All Saints.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, thanks to the way that he did it, and he explained, a lot of what he did was successful. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Sorry,
Yes.
Can you repeat the piece about All Saints?
Oh, yes. Well, All Saints was a chapel that was affiliated with St. Thomas Church, and it gained parochial status. Dr. Morris worked hard for that. But one of the things that Dr. Morris worked hard for was to have a free parish. So a parish that did not have pew rents. Because back in the time that Dr. Morris first arrived here as rector in 1954, pews were still being rented here. So in other words, you had to pay a fee every year, and the fee that you paid, that was your pew. So if you noticed on the pew racks, there are numbers there. So this family would have pew number 54 or pew number 6 or something like that. Dr. Morris ended that, and he started what was known as the Every Member Canvas, which is basically the standard for your everyday or your common stewardship campaign in Episcopal churches today. He felt that the church needed to be free for anybody who wanted to come. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to see the connection between the ownership of pews
Mhm.
and the inclusion
Right.
in the church. Is it connected? Is it believed that those who could afford to hold
Well, yeah. Well, basically, if you could afford to rent a pew here, you can come to St. Thomas Church. If you couldn't, you can't. And so Dr. Morris said, this is the house of God. This should be the house of God for all people, and we should not be, dictating who can and cannot come here. So he explained to the congregation, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And by November 5th, 1961, he said, this is going to take effect, and this is why we are doing this. And so he wanted St. Thomas to be a free church. And Anglo-Catholic parishes started doing this a long time ago, way before St. Thomas did. But he really believed that. So that is the connection for justice there. Letting anybody who is seeking God in his house, seek him in his house. Yes, ma'am.
I spent a little bit of time in Jackson, Mississippi.
Oh, yes, I'm very familiar with Jackson.
There was actually spent some time in a parish that was predominantly black priests and most
Right.
Christians, but it was a small parish.
Right. Is it St. Christopher's in Jackson? Is that what you're?
I don't recall.
Right.
I didn't get the name. I know that the priest there was also a professor at an HBCU in Jackson also.
Right.
But so that experience opened me up to see more representation in the Episcopal Church. But I'm curious from your perspective, what you think might allow families or communities to see some of the beauty of Episcopal life or Anglican life. And then also the two-part, I know that there's some kinds of conversations around the role of the Episcopal Church and the point of no return in Ghana. That's been
Right, yeah.
Church. So I'm curious as to whether that opening up the conversation or
Well,
models,
yeah.
whether-
And I will say, especially since the 50s onward, the Episcopal Church has done more and more increasing work among itself to state our relationship with a lot of the racial strife in this country has not been good. And there have been leaders from the top who have said we need to atone for this. And so there are dioceses who have done a lot of work to say we need to say that we are sorry for this. We need to own our part in this. And we need to do what we can to make sure that the Episcopal Church is open to all people. Because our theology, if you look at Anglican theology, there is no racial aspect to Anglican theology. Because Anglican theology goes back to the historic church and goes back to Jesus, who is God incarnate. And God had no intention for race whatsoever in his theology. And so it's taken the church a little while to get to that point, but is getting there. And that is how people can see how Anglican theology, espouses an openness to all people who seek God within its tradition. Oh, okay. I've been told that's it. So thank you all so very much. It was my honor to be here. Thank you.
And the recording of the lecture is going to be available, and I'm going to send the link by the end of the day.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Really, very, very instructive and very illuminating.
Thank you. Kindly appreciate it.